The tray slipped from Maria's hands and the sound of shattering glass cut through the diner like a gunshot. Every head turned. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then laughter erupted from the corner booth, sharp and cruel, led by a voice Maria knew too well. "Careful, sweetheart," Grace Bennett said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Some of us actually know how to carry a tray." Maria's face burned. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the broken pieces of glass with shaking fingers, ignoring the sting when a shard nicked her thumb. She said nothing. She never said anything. Saying something back only made it worse, and she could not afford worse. Not with rent due in 4 days and her mother's medicine costing more every month. The diner, called Rosalie's Kitchen, sat on the edge of a small town where everybody seemed to know everybody's business. It was not a fancy place, just red vinyl booths, a chalkboard menu, and the smell of coffee that never quite left the walls. But for Maria Lopez, it was everything. It was the only job that would take her without a long list of references, the only place that let her leave early twice a week to check on her mother, who had grown weaker every season for the past 2 years. She had been working there for 8 months. In that time, she had learned every trick to survive a lunch rush, memorized the names of the regulars, and perfected a smile that hid exhaustion. What she had not learned, no matter how hard she tried, was how to stop Grace and her friends from treating her like something to be scraped off their shoes. Grace Bennett was the star of Rosalie's Kitchen, or at least she believed she was. She had been working there the longest, knew the owner personally, and had somehow convinced herself and everyone around her that this gave her the right to decide who belonged and who did not. Beside her sat Olivia Turner, who laughed at everything Grace said a half-second too quickly, and Daniel Price, who leaned back with his arms crossed, enjoying the show without lifting a finger to stop it. "You know," Olivia said, watching Maria clean up the mess, "if you can't handle a full tray, maybe waitressing isn't for you." "Maybe she should go back to whatever she was doing before this," Daniel added, smirking. Maria did not look up. She swept the last of the glass into a dustpan, stood, and walked to the kitchen without a word. Her hands were trembling, but she would not let them see her cry. Crying was a currency she refused to spend on people like them. In the kitchen, the head cook, a heavy-set man named Kevin Doyle, glanced at her and then quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the grill. He was kind enough, but not the kind that stood up for anyone. Nobody at Rosalie's Kitchen ever did. It was easier to stay quiet than to become the next target. Maria dumped the broken glass into the trash and pressed a napkin against the small cut on her thumb. She took a breath, straightened her apron, and forced her lips into the practiced smile she wore like armor. Then she walked back onto the floor, because the tables would not clear themselves, and the bills would not pay themselves either. The lunch rush moved fast that day. Trucks from the nearby construction site rolled in around noon, and within minutes every booth was filled. Maria moved from table to table, balancing plates, refilling coffee, remembering orders without writing them down. She was good at her job. She was, in fact, better at it than Grace, Olivia, or Daniel combined, though none of them would ever admit that, and she never dared to claim it herself. It was during this rush that the owner, a quiet woman named Denise Caldwell, stepped out of her office and clapped her hands twice to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down. Even Grace, who rarely stopped talking, went silent. "I have an announcement," Denise said, holding a folded letter in her hand. "Some of you may have heard rumors about the diner being reviewed for a partnership program. I can confirm it now. Rosalie's Kitchen has been selected for a regional evaluation next month. If we pass, we could be featured in a statewide dining guide, and the diner could see real growth. New equipment, better hours, possibly even raises." A wave of excited murmurs spread through the staff. Grace's eyes lit up immediately, already imagining herself as the reason for any success. "But," Denise continued, raising her voice slightly, "the reviewer will not tell us exactly when they are coming. It could be any day in the next 4 weeks. And to make sure every part of this diner is ready, starting tomorrow, I am pairing up staff for training shifts. Everyone will work closely with a partner to sharpen weak spots and strengthen strong ones." She pulled out a second sheet of paper and began reading names aloud. Servers groaned and joked as pairs were announced, some pleased, some clearly disappointed. Then Denise reached the final pairing. Grace Bennett, she said. You will be paired with Maria Lopez. The diner went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Grace's mouth opened slightly, as if she had swallowed something bitter. Olivia turned to look at Maria with an expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. Daniel let out a short laugh before catching himself. There must be a mistake, Grace said, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. Maria just dropped an entire tray an hour ago. Surely there's someone more experienced I should be paired with. Denise did not look up from her clipboard. The pairings are final. Everyone will be evaluated individually and as a team. This is not a punishment, Grace. It's an opportunity. I suggest you treat it that way. Grace's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, at least not out loud. She turned to Olivia, and Maria could see the words forming behind her eyes, even without hearing them spoken. This was going to be a disaster, and it was going to be Maria's fault. Maria felt a strange mix of dread and disbelief settle in her stomach. Working alongside Grace, the very person who had spent months making her feel small, was not something she had ever imagined. Part of her wanted to ask Denise to change the pairing, to save herself from what was surely going to be 4 weeks of quiet torment. But another part of her, a part she rarely listened to because it felt too dangerous to hope, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to prove something. Not to Grace, not even to Denise, to herself. That evening, Maria walked home instead of taking the bus, needing the extra time to think. The autumn air was cool against her face, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional car passing by. Her mind kept circling back to Grace's expression when her name had been read aloud, that flicker of horror quickly hidden behind irritation. She thought about her mother, lying in bed at home, needing her medication refilled by the end of the week. She thought about the cut on her thumb, still stinging faintly beneath the bandage. She thought about 8 months of swallowed insults, 8 months of smiling through humiliation, because the alternative was unemployment and an empty refrigerator. When she reached her small apartment, she found her mother sitting up in bed, watching an old show on a television with a cracked corner. Her mother's face brightened the moment she saw her. "You're later than usual," her mother said, her voice thin but warm. "Long day?" Maria sat on the edge of the bed and took her mother's hand. "Something happened at work. They're pairing us up for training. I got paired with Grace." Her mother's eyebrows rose. She had heard enough stories over the past few months to know exactly who Grace was. "The one who mocked your shoes last winter? That's her." Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "Then show her who you are, mija. Not with anger, with work. Let your hands speak when your mouth cannot." Maria smiled faintly, comforted by words she had heard many times before, yet somehow they always landed with fresh strength. She kissed her mother's forehead, made a simple dinner for them both, and later that night, lying awake in the dark, she allowed herself, just this once, to imagine a different version of tomorrow, one where she was not the target, one where, for the first time since she had started at Rosalie's kitchen, she was seen. Morning came quickly, and with it, a strange, nervous energy that Maria had not felt in months. She arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, tied her apron with practiced hands, and waited by the coffee station, watching the door. Grace walked in exactly on time, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, expression carefully neutral, as if she had rehearsed indifference in the mirror that morning. She glanced at Maria, gave a short nod that held no warmth, and said only, "Let's get this over with." Maria nodded back. "Okay." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the months of small cruelties, no sudden change of heart. Just two women standing in a diner, forced together by a piece of paper neither of them had chosen, about to begin 4 weeks that neither of them could yet imagine would change everything. Denise stepped out of her office one last time before the morning rush began, addressing the full staff. "Remember, the evaluator could walk through that door on any day, without warning. I expect every pair to be ready. Full commitment, no shortcuts." The bell above the door jingled as the first customer of the day walked in, an older man in a flannel jacket who took his usual seat by the window. Maria picked up her notepad, glanced once at Grace, and walked toward the table, her heart pounding with a nervous energy that felt, for the first time in a long while, less like fear and more like the quiet beginning of a chance. The first hour of the shift passed in careful silence. Grace took the register, handling payments with brisk efficiency, while Maria managed the floor, greeting customers, taking orders, and delivering plates with a steadiness that came from months of practice nobody had ever noticed. Neither woman spoke unless it was necessary, and even then, the words were clipped and businesslike. By mid-morning, the diner filled with a mix of regulars and a few unfamiliar faces passing through town. Among them sat a stern-looking man in a gray coat who took a booth near the back, ordered black coffee, and said little else. He kept glancing at his watch, then at the staff, then back at his watch, as though timing something only he understood. Maria noticed him immediately. Something about the way he observed the room, quiet and calculating, made her stomach tighten. She wondered, briefly, if this could be the reviewer Denise had warned them about, but she pushed the thought away. Worrying about it would not help her carry plates any faster. Around 11, the real test began. A large group of construction workers pushed through the door, laughing loudly, dropping their hard hats onto empty chairs, calling out orders before they had even sat down. 12 men, all hungry, all impatient, filled 2 long tables at once. Grace's eyes widened slightly. She had handled large groups before, but never without at least one experienced server backing her up, and today, her backup was the very person she had spent months belittling. "Take the left table," Grace said quickly, trying to sound confident. "I'll take the right." Maria nodded and moved without hesitation, notepad ready. She greeted the men with a warm, practiced smile, memorized their orders in rapid succession without writing most of them down, and moved to the next table, before Grace had even finished greeting her own group. At the register, tickets began printing rapidly. In the kitchen, Kevin Doyle worked the grill with sweat beading on his forehead, calling out when plates were ready. The noise of clattering dishes, sizzling meat, and overlapping conversation filled the diner like a rising tide. Halfway through taking orders, Grace's table erupted into complaints. One of the workers, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, raised his voice. "We ordered 15 minutes ago. Where's our food?" Grace hurried to the kitchen window, her composure slipping. "I need 3 burgers and 2 orders of fries now," she said sharply to Kevin, who was already moving as fast as he could. "They're coming," Kevin muttered without looking up, one at a time. Grace's hands fumbled with a stack of plates as she tried to carry too many at once, panic creeping into her movements. A glass tipped, spilling water across the counter. She grabbed a rag, wiped it hastily, and turned back toward her table, only to realize she had forgotten who ordered what. Maria, meanwhile, moved through her own table with calm precision. She balanced 4 plates along her arm without a single wobble, delivered them to the correct customers without needing to ask, and refilled drinks before anyone even requested it. When one of the workers asked for extra napkins, she produced them from her apron pocket without missing a step, having anticipated the need before he spoke. "You're fast," the bearded worker said, glancing over from Grace's table, clearly impressed. How come she's not handling both tables? Grace overheard the comment and stiffened, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She forced a laugh. "We're just getting warmed up," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The lunch rush stretched on, each minute adding new pressure. At one point, a young mother at a nearby table accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice, sending it toward her toddler seated in a high chair. Grace was closest, but she froze for half a second too long, unsure whether to grab the child or the glass first. Maria was already moving. She swept in from the side, catching the child's arm, and gently pulling the high chair back just enough to avoid the spill soaking the little one's lap, while grabbing a stack of napkins from her apron with her other hand. Within seconds, the mess was contained. The toddler was giggling instead of crying, and the young mother was thanking Maria with visible relief. "Thank you so much," the woman said, clutching her son close. "You were so quick." "It happens all the time," Maria said gently, wiping down the table with practiced ease. "He's just curious about that juice, that's all." The man in the gray coat, still seated in his booth near the back, watched the entire exchange without blinking, his coffee untouched in front of him. He made a small note in a leather notebook resting on the table, though nobody noticed at the time. By the time the lunch rush finally slowed, both women were exhausted, but only one of them looked shaken. Grace leaned against the counter, catching her breath, strands of hair sticking to her damp forehead. Maria stood a few feet away, refilling the coffee station, her breathing steady despite the chaos of the past 2 hours. "You've done this before," Grace said finally, breaking the silence between them for the first time all day. It was not quite a compliment, but it was not an insult either, which for Grace felt strangely significant. Maria looked up, surprised by the sudden acknowledgement. "I've been doing it for 8 months," she said simply. "Same as you were once." Grace opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. She glanced toward the back booth, where the man in the gray coat was finally rising to leave, placing a folded bill on the table and walking out without a word. "Who was that?" Grace asked, mostly to herself. Maria shrugged. "Just a customer, I think." Neither of them knew, in that moment, how wrong that guess would turn out to be. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Grace and Maria worked side by side during every shift, sharing tasks that had once belonged solely to whichever server happened to be nearby. At first, Grace treated the arrangement as a formality to endure, speaking only when necessary, her tone clipped and distant. But slowly, almost against her will, she began to notice things about Maria she had never bothered to notice before. She noticed how Maria always remembered which regulars liked their coffee black and which preferred cream, without ever needing to ask twice. She noticed how Maria handled difficult customers with a calm patience that Grace herself often lacked, diffusing tension with a soft word instead of a sharp one. She noticed, most surprisingly, that Maria never once complained, not when her feet ached after a double shift, not when a customer was rude, not even when Olivia made a snide comment in passing about her worn sneakers. One afternoon, during a rare lull between customers, Grace found herself standing beside Maria at the coffee station, both women taking a short breath before the next wave of orders arrived. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, her voice quieter than usual. Maria glanced over, cautious. "Sure." "Why do you never say anything? When Olivia or Daniel say things about you, why don't you ever fight back?" Maria considered the question for a moment, wiping down the counter as she thought. "Fighting back costs energy I don't have to spare," she said finally. "And most days, I need that energy for things that actually matter, like getting through a shift, like taking care of my mother." Grace blinked, caught off guard by the mention of a mother she had never known existed. "Your mother?" "She's sick," Maria said simply, not elaborating further, not looking for sympathy, just stating a fact of her life, the way one might mention the weather. "I work here because it lets me be flexible for her appointments. That's all that matters to me most days." For the first time since they had been paired together, Grace found herself without a single sharp comment to offer. She stood in silence, processing information that did not fit the picture she had built in her mind of the quiet, clumsy waitress she had mocked for months without ever really looking at her. That night, walking home alone, Grace found herself replaying the conversation over and over, along with the image of Maria calmly catching a falling toddler while she herself had frozen in place. She thought about the tray incident from the day before their pairing began, the shattering glass, her own laughter ringing through the diner. For reasons she could not fully explain, the memory no longer felt satisfying. It felt, instead, uncomfortably heavy. Meanwhile, unnoticed by anyone at Rosalie's kitchen, the man in the gray coat sat in his car, outside a modest office building 3 towns over, reviewing his notes from the day. His name was Walter Ashford, and he was indeed the reviewer Denise had been warned about, sent by a regional dining guide to quietly observe several candidate restaurants before making his final recommendations. Rosalie's kitchen was not the only diner on his list, but something about the young waitress who had handled the toddler incident so effortlessly had stayed with him. He flipped through several pages of notes on other establishments, comparing service quality, cleanliness, and staff behavior, before circling back to a single line he had written about Rosalie's kitchen: exceptional composure under pressure, remarkable attention to customer needs, worth a follow-up visit. He closed his notebook, started his car, and drove away, unaware that his simple visit had already begun to shift the balance inside a small diner he might never think about again after his final report was filed. But for Maria and Grace, the effects of that quiet morning would prove to be only the beginning of something far larger than either of them yet understood. The days that followed brought new challenges. each one testing the fragile new dynamic between the two women. A delivery truck arrived late one afternoon, leaving the kitchen short on key ingredients right before the dinner rush. Normally, such a shortage would have caused chaos, with servers scrambling and customers growing impatient. But Maria, thinking quickly, suggested substitute dishes using what remained in stock, walking table to table, to explain the temporary changes with such warmth and confidence that not a single customer complained. Grace watched this unfold from across the room, arms crossed, studying Maria's technique, the way a student studies a difficult lesson. She began, almost unconsciously, adjusting her own approach, softening her tone with customers, taking a beat longer to listen instead of rushing through orders. The change was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Maria caught it, and something like cautious hope stirred in her chest, though she was careful not to let herself trust it too quickly. Old habits, after all, did not disappear overnight, and not everyone at Rosalie's kitchen was ready to let go of the comfortable cruelty they had grown used to. Olivia Turner watched the shift between Grace and Maria with growing suspicion, unwilling to accept that the target of her jokes for so many months might actually deserve respect. And Daniel Price, sensing that his usual partner in mockery was slipping away from him, decided he would need to work harder to keep the old dynamic alive, even if it meant pushing Maria further than anyone had pushed her before. Daniel Price had never liked losing his position at the top of the diner's social order, and he liked it even less watching Grace soften toward the woman she used to mock so easily. He decided the following week that he would remind everyone, especially Maria, exactly where she stood. His chance came on a busy Thursday evening, when the diner was packed with families finishing dinner before a local football game. Maria was carrying a tray loaded with drinks toward a table near the window, when Daniel, walking the opposite direction with an empty bin of dishes, shifted his path at the last second, just enough to clip her elbow. The tray tilted. Maria caught it with a quick twist of her wrist, saving most of the glasses, but one tipped over the edge and shattered on the floor, sending soda spraying across a nearby chair. "Watch where you're going," Daniel said loudly, shaking his head as though she had been the clumsy one, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, the old familiar shame threatening to surface. But this time, before she could even respond, Grace stepped forward from behind the counter. "I saw that, Daniel," Grace said, her voice sharp and clear. "You bumped into her on purpose." Daniel's smirk faltered. "I did not. She wasn't paying attention." "I was standing right there," Grace said, crossing her arms. "Don't do that again." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it rippled through the diner like a stone dropped into still water. Olivia, watching from the register, exchanged a startled glance with another server. Nobody had ever heard Grace defend Maria before, and certainly not against one of her own friends. Daniel opened his mouth to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, muttering something under his breath, before disappearing into the back to gather a mop. Maria knelt to clean up the broken glass herself, her hands steady despite the small tremor of surprise still running through her chest. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly to Grace, once Daniel was out of earshot. "Yes, I did," Grace replied, kneeling beside her to help gather the pieces. "It wasn't fair. None of it ever was." Maria studied Grace's face for a long moment, searching for insincerity, some hidden motive behind the sudden kindness. She found none, just tired honesty, the kind that came from someone finally seeing clearly after months of choosing not to look. The two women finished cleaning in silence, and for the rest of the shift, something between them had shifted permanently, though neither said so directly. It was in the way Grace began covering for Maria's tables when she needed a short break, and the way Maria started sharing small tips about handling difficult customers that she had learned through months of hard experience. 2 days later, the real test arrived, one neither woman could have predicted. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when an elderly regular named Mr. Abernathy, a retired schoolteacher who visited the diner nearly every day for a slice of pie and black coffee, suddenly began coughing violently at his usual table near the window. Within seconds, his face turned a deep shade of red, his hands clutching at his throat, his chair scraping backward as he struggled to breathe. Panic rippled through the diner. A woman at a nearby table gasped and covered her mouth. Olivia froze behind the counter, phone in hand, fumbling to unlock it to call for help. Daniel, who was closest, simply stood frozen, unsure what to do, his earlier bravado completely gone. Maria was across the room, but she moved instantly, weaving between tables with a speed that startled everyone watching. She reached Mr. Abernathy just as his lips had started to turn a worrying shade of blue. "I need space, please," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the urgency of the moment. She positioned herself behind him, wrapped her arms around his midsection, and performed a series of firm upward thrusts, exactly as she had been trained to do years earlier, during a brief but important certification course she had completed long before working at Rosalie's kitchen, back when she had once considered training as an emergency medical responder, before life's circumstances redirected her path. The first thrust did nothing. The second produced a strangled gasp. On the third attempt, a small piece of food dislodged and flew from Mr. Abernathy's mouth, and he collapsed forward slightly, gasping and coughing, air finally rushing back into his lungs. The diner erupted into a mixture of relieved gasps and scattered applause. Mr. Abernathy, shaking and pale, gripped the edge of the table, tears of gratitude welling in his eyes, as Maria knelt beside him, checking his pulse and speaking to him in a calm, reassuring voice. "You're okay," she said softly. "Just breathe slowly, in and out. You're safe now." Grace, who had rushed over the moment the commotion began, stood frozen a few steps away, watching Maria work with a competence that seemed almost impossible for someone who spent her days quietly clearing tables and refilling coffee cups without complaint. Denise emerged from her office at the sound of the commotion, her face pale with worry, relaxing only when she saw Mr. Abernathy sitting upright, color slowly returning to his cheeks. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "He was choking," Maria explained calmly. "He's fine now. I think we should still have someone check on him, just to be safe." Denise nodded quickly, already reaching for the phone to call for medical assistance as a precaution, while thanking Maria repeatedly, her voice trembling with relief. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. Maria hesitated for a brief moment, unused to being the center of attention for something other than a mistake. "A long time ago," she said simply. "Before everything changed for my family, I was studying to become a paramedic. I never finished, but some things stay with you." The words hung in the air, revealing a piece of Maria's past that nobody at the diner had ever known. Grace stared at her, stunned, pieces of a puzzle she had never bothered to examine slowly clicking into place. The waitress she had mocked for clumsiness had once been training to save lives, only for circumstances beyond her control to pull her onto a different path entirely. Word of the incident spread through the diner within minutes, customers whispering to each other, several thanking Maria personally before leaving, one man even offering to pay for his entire table's meal as a gesture of gratitude, which Denise gently declined, insisting it was simply part of doing the right thing. Olivia, who had frozen uselessly during the emergency, avoided Maria's gaze for the rest of the shift, embarrassment evident in the way she kept to the far side of the diner. Daniel, similarly shaken by his own failure to act, said little for the remainder of the day, his usual confidence visibly dented. That evening, after closing, Denise called Maria into her office, a small cluttered room filled with paperwork and old photographs of the diner from decades past. "I want to thank you properly," Denise said, gesturing for Maria to sit. "What you did today could have saved that man's life." "I just did what needed to be done," Maria said, still slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "That's exactly the point," Denise replied. "Most people freeze in moments like that. You didn't. That tells me something important about who you are, something I clearly haven't been paying enough attention to." Maria shifted in her seat, unsure how to respond to such direct acknowledgement after months of feeling invisible. Denise continued, her tone thoughtful. "I've noticed the changes over the past 2 weeks too, you know. The way you and Grace have been working together. The way the whole floor seems to run smoother when you're on shift. I don't think that's a coincidence." "Grace has been trying," Maria admitted. "It hasn't been easy for either of us." "Growth rarely is," Denise said, offering a small, tired smile. "But I want you to know, whatever happens with the evaluation next month, I see the effort you've been putting in, all of it, not just today." Maria left the office that evening with something she had not felt in a long time, a fragile but genuine sense of being valued. Walking home under a sky scattered with early evening stars, she allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine that maybe her circumstances were beginning to shift, even if only slightly, even if only for now. Meanwhile, 3 towns over, Walter Ashford sat at his desk, reviewing reports from several diners he had visited over the past month, as part of his evaluation process. He pulled up a local news alert that had been shared briefly online, a short article about a customer being saved from choking at a small diner called Rosalie's Kitchen, praising the quick actions of an unnamed waitress. He read the article twice, then pulled out his notebook, flipping back to the page where he had written his earlier observations about the same diner. He circled Rosalie's Kitchen's name a second time, adding a new note beneath his earlier comments. Staff exhibits genuine care beyond standard service. Incident response demonstrates real training and composure. Recommend priority follow-up visit. He had not yet realized just how deeply connected this diner would soon become to something far more personal than a simple regional evaluation, a connection that would reveal itself only days later, in a moment neither Maria nor Grace could have anticipated, forever changing the course of both their lives. Back at Rosalie's Kitchen, the following days brought a quieter, more thoughtful atmosphere among the staff. Olivia, still shaken by her own frozen reaction during the emergency, began speaking to Maria with a hesitant politeness she had never shown before. Small gestures like holding a door open or offering to help carry a heavy tray. Gestures that felt awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. Daniel remained more distant, clearly uncomfortable with how the emergency had exposed his own hesitation in a moment that demanded courage, but even he found himself glancing at Maria with something closer to grudging respect rather than open mockery, a change subtle enough that only those paying close attention would notice it at all. Grace, more than anyone, seemed transformed by the events of the past 2 weeks. She began arriving earlier for her shifts, taking initiative on tasks she once avoided, and most surprisingly, she started defending Maria without hesitation, whenever Olivia or Daniel slipped back into old habits of casual disrespect. One afternoon, during a slow stretch between customers, Grace found herself sitting across from Maria in an empty booth, both women finally taking a proper break together for the first time since their pairing began. "Can I tell you something?" Grace asked, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. Maria nodded, waiting. "I used to think being good at this job meant being loud, being noticed, being the one everyone talked about," Grace said slowly. "I never thought about what it actually meant to take care of people. Real care, I mean. Like what you did for Mr. Abernathy." "You take care of people too," Maria said gently. "You just needed a reminder of how." Grace looked down at her coffee, quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she finally said, the words simple, but heavy with meaning. Neither of them needed to explain further. For everything before, the tray, the comments, all of it. Maria felt something unexpected loosen in her chest, a tightness she had carried for months without fully realizing its weight. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "It means more than you probably realize." The 2 women sat together in comfortable silence after that, the diner humming quietly around them, sunlight slanting through the windows in warm afternoon light, both unaware that their fragile new partnership was about to be tested one final time, in a way that would reveal far more than either of them had ever imagined possible. The morning the evaluation truly began, nobody at Rosalie's Kitchen knew it had started at all. It was a Friday, 3 weeks into the pairing program, and the diner buzzed with its usual early rush of coffee orders and quick breakfasts before the workday began for most of the town. Maria arrived early as always, tying her apron with steady hands, while Grace walked in just behind her, offering a small wave instead of the cold nod she once reserved for greetings. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bell above the door rang, and Walter Ashford stepped inside, wearing the same gray coat he had worn weeks earlier, though this time he did not head for a quiet booth in the back. Instead, he walked directly toward the counter, where Denise stood reviewing the morning's receipts. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Walter Ashford. I represent the Regional Dining Evaluation Board, along with a partner organization I'll explain shortly. I've visited your establishment twice now, though you were unaware of my first visit." Denise's eyes widened slightly, her hand pausing mid-shake. "Twice?" "Once about 5 weeks ago, and again more recently," Walter confirmed. "I'd like to gather the staff together, if that's possible. What I have to share concerns everyone here." Denise, though clearly caught off guard, nodded and called out across the diner, asking every available server to gather near the front counter. Maria, Grace, Olivia, and Daniel exchanged uncertain glances as they approached, along with Kevin Doyle, who stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, curiosity plain on his face. Walter waited until everyone had assembled before speaking again, his tone calm but carrying a quiet authority that made the room fall silent almost immediately. "5 weeks ago, I visited this diner as part of a routine evaluation for a statewide dining guide," he began. "I sat in a booth near the back, ordered coffee, and observed the staff, as I do at every location I review. During that visit, I witnessed an incident I have not been able to forget." He paused, letting his gaze move slowly across the group, before settling briefly on Grace, then Olivia, then Daniel. "I watched a young server drop a tray of glasses," he continued, "and I watched several of her coworkers laugh at her, openly, in front of customers, rather than offering to help. I made a note of it at the time, though I did not act on it immediately, as such behavior, unfortunately, is not always considered disqualifying on its own." Grace's face drained of color. Olivia's hands twisted nervously in front of her. Daniel stared at the floor, unable to meet Walter's steady gaze. "I returned recently for a second visit," Walter went on, "and witnessed something entirely different. A large group of demanding customers, a spilled drink near a small child, handled without hesitation by the very same server I had seen humiliated weeks earlier. I also witnessed a genuine partnership beginning to form between staff members who had previously shown little regard for one another." He turned toward Maria now, his expression softening slightly. "And then, just over a week ago, I received a report of a customer being saved from choking at this establishment, through the quick actions of an employee with, as it turns out, prior emergency training." Maria felt her cheeks warm under the sudden attention, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "I looked further into your background, Ms. Lopez," Walter said. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but given the nature of our evaluation, thorough research is standard practice. I learned that you had once been enrolled in a paramedic training program, before family circumstances forced you to withdraw in order to care for your mother." Maria's breath caught slightly. She had never shared those details with anyone at the diner, beyond the brief explanation she had given Denise the day of the choking incident. "I represent more than just a dining guide," Walter continued. "I also sit on the board of a small foundation that provides scholarships and flexible training programs for individuals whose personal circumstances interrupted promising careers in emergency medical services. Programs designed specifically for people like you, Ms. Lopez, who had to choose between their ambitions and their families." The diner had gone completely silent, every customer and staff member listening intently, though most did not yet understand the full significance of what was unfolding. "I would like to offer you a place in our foundation's next training cohort," Walter said, addressing Maria directly. "Flexible scheduling, financial support, and a mentorship program designed to help you complete your paramedic certification without sacrificing your ability to care for your mother." For a long moment, Maria could not find any words at all. She stood frozen, disbelief washing over her in waves, her mind struggling to process an opportunity she had long ago convinced herself was permanently out of reach. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed, her voice unsteady. "You don't need to decide right now," Walter said gently. "Take some time to think it over. My contact information will be with Ms. Caldwell." He turned back toward the rest of the staff, his expression hardening slightly as he addressed the group as a whole. "As for the diner's evaluation, I want to be clear that the events I witnessed on my first visit, the mockery and humiliation of a coworker, are precisely the kind of behavior that damages an establishment's standing far more than any spilled tray ever could. Genuine hospitality begins with how staff treat one another, not just how they treat paying customers." Grace stepped forward suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. What happened to Maria was wrong, and it happened because of me, more than anyone else. I own that. Walter studied her for a long moment, something like cautious respect flickering across his expression. Acknowledging a mistake is the first step toward correcting it, he said. What I've observed over these past weeks suggests genuine change, not just words. That matters both to my evaluation and, I suspect, to the people you work alongside. Just as the tension in the room began to ease slightly, a sharp beeping sound cut through the diner, followed almost immediately by a shout from the kitchen. Fire! Grease fire on the stove! Panic erupted instantly. Customers near the kitchen door scrambled backward, chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Smoke began curling out from the kitchen entrance, thick and dark, accompanied by the sharp smell of burning oil. Kevin Doyle stumbled out, coughing, his hands raised protectively in front of his face. I tried to smother it, but it's spreading, he gasped. The pan's too hot. Denise froze for a split second, her eyes wide with fear, before fumbling for her phone to call emergency services. Olivia backed away toward the front door, pulling frightened customers along with her. Daniel stood rooted in place, staring at the smoke with wide, panicked eyes, unable to move. Maria moved instantly, cutting through her own shock with practiced focus. Everyone out of the kitchen, now, she commanded, her voice carrying clearly over the rising panic. Grace, get customers away from this side of the diner and toward the front exit. Kevin, is the fire extinguisher still under the counter? Kevin nodded, still coughing. Should be, yeah. Maria rushed toward the counter, yanking open the cabinet beneath the register and pulling out a small red extinguisher. She checked the pressure gauge with a quick glance, pulled the safety pin exactly as she had been trained to do years earlier, and moved swiftly toward the kitchen entrance, keeping low to avoid the thickening smoke. Inside, flames danced across the surface of a large frying pan, licking upward toward the overhead vent. Maria aimed the extinguisher's nozzle at the base of the flames, squeezing the handle firmly, sweeping the white foam back and forth across the pan, exactly as her training had once taught her, back before life had pulled her away from that particular path. The flames sputtered, shrank, and finally died out entirely, leaving behind a thick cloud of smoke and the acrid smell of burnt oil. Maria stood still for a moment, extinguisher still raised, chest heaving slightly from the sudden burst of adrenaline, before setting it down carefully on the counter. It's out, she called, her voice slightly hoarse from the smoke. Someone open the back door. We need to clear this air. Grace rushed to comply, throwing open the kitchen's back exit, while Kevin propped open a window near the grill. Within a minute, the worst of the smoke began clearing, revealing a scorched but otherwise undamaged section of stovetop, no further flames in sight. Walter Ashford, who had followed close behind during the chaos, stood near the kitchen entrance, watching the entire scene unfold with an expression of quiet astonishment. He had seen countless staff members freeze under pressure during his years of evaluations, but rarely had he witnessed someone move with such immediate, practiced competence in the face of genuine danger. That, he said slowly, once the immediate danger had passed, is exactly the kind of composure our foundation looks for in candidates. Denise, still shaken from the scare, hurried over to check on everyone, relief flooding her face when she confirmed no one had been injured. Is everyone all right? Maria, are you hurt? I'm fine, Maria said, wiping a streak of ash from her cheek. Just need some fresh air for a minute. She stepped toward the open back door, breathing in the cool morning air, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. Grace followed close behind, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. You just saved this entire diner, Grace said quietly, disbelief evident in her voice. Twice in 1 month. Maria managed a tired smile. I just did what needed to be done. Same as always. No, Grace said firmly, shaking her head. Not the same as always. Nobody else here could have done what you just did. Not me, not Daniel, not Olivia. You. Behind them, Walter Ashford made a final note in his leather notebook before closing it decisively. His decision regarding Rosalie's kitchen's evaluation and regarding one particular waitress's future, already firmly settled in his mind. As the diner slowly returned to a semblance of normal operation, customers cautiously returning to their tables once the smoke had cleared. Whispers began to spread about the second dramatic rescue performed by the same quiet waitress who had once been the target of so much casual cruelty. For Grace, Olivia, and Daniel, the morning's events represented far more than a simple kitchen fire. It represented a turning point none of them could ignore any longer, a clear and undeniable demonstration of exactly who among them truly deserved respect, and exactly who still had considerable work left to do in earning it back. 3 weeks passed before Rosalie's Kitchen received the official results of its evaluation, and during that time, the diner itself seemed to transform in ways nobody could have predicted at the start of the pairing program. Denise called a full staff meeting on a quiet Sunday morning before opening hours, gathering everyone around 2 pushed-together tables near the front window. She held a formal letter in her hands, the seal of the regional dining guide printed clearly across the top, and her expression carried a mixture of nervousness and hope that mirrored the feelings of everyone seated around her. "I'll just read it," she said, unfolding the letter carefully. "Rosalie's Kitchen has been officially selected for inclusion in this year's statewide dining guide, recognized specifically for exceptional customer care and outstanding staff teamwork under pressure." A wave of relieved cheers broke out around the table. Kevin Doyle pumped his fist in the air, grinning widely for the first time in weeks. Denise continued reading, her voice growing thicker with emotion as she reached the final paragraph. "The evaluator specifically noted 2 separate emergency incidents handled with remarkable skill and composure by a member of staff, whose actions reflect the very best of what community dining establishments should represent." Every eye in the room turned toward Maria, who sat quietly near the end of the table, her cheeks flushing under the sudden attention. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand gently beneath the table, a small gesture that meant more than any words could have. "This inclusion means real changes for all of us," Denise continued. "New equipment for the kitchen, extended hours, and yes, raises for every member of staff, effective immediately." The room erupted into genuine celebration this time, servers hugging one another, Kevin already discussing plans for the new equipment with obvious excitement. Amid the celebration, Denise turned to Maria with a warmer, more personal expression. "I also want to formally offer you a promotion," she said. "Shift supervisor, with a schedule flexible enough to accommodate your mother's needs, and a raise that reflects everything you've contributed here, both today and over these past many months." Maria felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by a moment she had never allowed herself to fully imagine. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what else to say." "You've earned every bit of it," Denise said firmly. "More than earned it." Later that same week, Maria sat across from Walter Ashford in a small office belonging to his foundation, finally ready to give her answer regarding the paramedic training program he had offered weeks earlier. The office was modest but warm, filled with framed photographs of previous scholarship recipients, many of them now working as certified paramedics and emergency responders across the region. "I've thought about it carefully," Maria said, folding her hands in her lap, "and I'd like to accept the offer." Walter smiled, genuine warmth replacing his usually reserved expression. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll work out a schedule that fits around your responsibilities at the diner and with your mother. This program moves at whatever pace works best for you." "Thank you," Maria said, "for everything, for noticing, when so many people didn't." "You made it easy to notice," Walter replied. "Talent and character like yours don't stay hidden for long, even when circumstances try their best to keep them buried." That evening, Maria returned home to find her mother sitting up in bed, stronger than she had seemed in weeks, thanks in part to a new course of medication that had finally begun showing real results. Maria sat beside her, sharing the news of her promotion and the scholarship offer, watching her mother's tired eyes fill with proud tears. "You never gave up," her mother said softly, cupping Maria's face gently in her weathered hands. "Even when everything felt impossible, you kept showing up, kept working hard, kept believing something better was possible." "I almost didn't," Maria admitted quietly. "Some days, it felt easier to just accept how things were. But you didn't accept it," her mother said. "And now look at everything that's changed." Back at Rosalie's Kitchen, the changes extended beyond raises and new equipment. "Grace," who had spent months at the center of casual cruelty toward Maria, now found herself in an unexpected leadership role alongside her former target, the two women working together as shift supervisors, planning schedules and training new staff members with a partnership that felt entirely natural after everything they had endured together. Olivia, deeply affected by her own frozen reaction during both the choking incident and the kitchen fire, approached Denise privately one afternoon, requesting additional training in emergency response procedures, determined never again to feel so helpless during a genuine crisis. Denise arranged for her to attend a basic safety course through Walters Foundation, and Olivia threw herself into the training with a seriousness nobody at the diner had seen from her before. Daniel Price faced a more difficult reckoning. Denise called him into her office privately, addressing not just his frozen response during the fire, but the pattern of behavior he had displayed toward Maria over many months before the pairing program began. She issued a formal written warning, along with a clear expectation that any further disrespect toward coworkers would result in immediate termination. Daniel, humbled by the experience and genuinely shaken by his own failure during the emergency, made a visible effort over the following weeks to change his behavior, offering quiet apologies to Maria that, while awkward and imperfect, seemed rooted in real reflection rather than mere obligation. "I wasn't a good person to work with," he admitted to her one slow afternoon, unable to fully meet her eyes. "I'm working on it." "I appreciate you saying that," Maria replied simply, choosing to extend the same patience toward his growth that she wished someone had once extended toward her own struggles. As the months passed, Rosalie's Kitchen settled into its new identity as a genuinely celebrated local establishment, regulars returning more frequently, new customers drawn in by its inclusion in the regional dining guide, staff morale higher than anyone could remember it being in years. Maria balanced her supervisor duties with her paramedic training, attending evening classes twice a week, while continuing to care for her mother, whose health continued its slow but steady improvement. On a warm afternoon nearly 6 months after the pairing program had first begun, Maria stood behind the counter of Rosalie's Kitchen, watching Grace train a nervous new hire on proper table service, patiently correcting mistakes with a gentleness that would have seemed impossible to imagine a year earlier. "You've come a long way," Maria said, smiling as Grace joined her at the counter during a brief lull. "We both have," Grace replied, glancing toward the front window where sunlight streamed across the familiar red vinyl booths. "I used to think being noticed meant being the loudest person in the room. Turns out, real strength looks a lot quieter than that." Maria nodded, thinking of the countless quiet moments that had brought her to this point. The shattered glass, the frozen fear in strangers' eyes during moments of crisis, the slow and difficult work of earning respect she had deserved all along. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, and inside Rosalie's Kitchen, the gentle hum of conversation and clinking dishes filled the air, a small diner transformed not by luck or circumstance alone, but by the quiet, persistent strength of one woman who had never stopped showing up, even when the world around her gave her every reason to stop believing she mattered. Her name, once spoken with mockery and careless voices, was now spoken with genuine respect throughout the town, not because she had ever demanded it, but because she had simply continued doing what she had always done best, taking care of people, one small act of quiet courage at a time.